Great. So welcome to today's session for all of you who are joining live, or for everyone who will be listening to this via the recording. You're very, very welcome. This is the sixth in the CGF Healthier and More Sustainable Diets learning series, a series that was created by a core group that we have here of our members who really want to look at a spectrum of topics on how we can really drive and shift consumption towards healthier and more sustainable diets. And of course, today I'm thrilled to be with Joshua Bishop, conservation economist with WWF in Australia. So Joshua, a very, very warm welcome. And just before we get into the details of today's session, I will give you just a little bit of context for those of you who are joining maybe your first session in the series. So I'm Sharon Bly, and I lead the Coalition of Action here at the Consumer Goods Forum. And all of these sessions, it's a learning series, so we would love to have your questions either through the Q&A option that you can see on your toolbar. Of course, don't hesitate to type into the chat. In any case, what we will do is we will get back to you, whether it's live on today's session or if you're listening to the recording. Just drop a note to hw@theconsumergoodsforum.com and we'll make sure that we get back to your question. So please do think about what you'd love to hear from Josh, and we will make sure that we respond to you. So as I mentioned, this learning series was created by a core team of our members who really wanted to see, as I said, how they could drive and shift consumption patterns and behavior changes towards healthier and more sustainable diets. We came up with three really critical elements in what we believed that means. You can see them here on your screen, supporting obviously a balanced and diverse food consumption with appropriate nutrient and calorie intake, has obviously lower environmental pressure and impact, and is accessible, affordable, equitable, and I should say delicious and desirable. And of course, this group that has come together to really drive action is leveraging what already exists and is not a group that is looking to recreate definitions or recreate existing expertise. We want to be based on science and then go to action to really see where we can build evidence about what works and what doesn't in shifting those behaviors. The core team in the coalition has chosen 5 priority areas which we're focusing on, and you'll see if you're following this learning series throughout 2022, you'll see that we have touched on almost all of these topics in our sessions. The first one is more plants on plate, empowering consumer choice with a specific focus on the role of environmental labeling, and we know the key role that it plays, better for you and the planet, dairy and meat, right sizing consumption, underconsumption and overconsumption, and health and food waste, and how those two thematic areas come together. And in particular, at the moment, food waste is a very topical topic with the state of things in the world at the moment. So we are sharing learnings from experts from around the globe on these topics, and also the core team is looking at different pilot projects that exist from France to China to Turkey, around the globe, to see what are the different interventions that are happening at our retailers and manufacturers to drive this behavior change. And our objective, as with everything we do with the CGF, is to share back those learnings with the wider membership. So if you want to know more about that core team and what they're trying to achieve, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I can bring you up to speed on who they are and what they are trying to achieve within the overarching coalition on healthier lives. Just a quick note to say everything will be recorded as today's session, and you can find all of them on the website of the Consumer Goods Forum. And just to call out for the next session, it will be on the 2nd of November at 3 p.m. European time, when we look at future foods and what we will be consuming and trends that we're seeing coming in the future to help us reach the ambition of healthier and more sustainable diets. And with that, I will hand you over to Joshua Bishop, who has, I think, really interesting viewpoints on putting the value on nature and bringing in that economic aspect as well on environmental economics. And it's been fascinating speaking with you, Joshua, to date. And we wanted to really deep dive into this whole area on communicating sustainability to consumers. We know that this is absolutely key and fundamental for any forms of behavior change, but it isn't easy. And changing behaviors are complex, and getting this right and getting the same information to consumers all around the globe is a real challenge. And there's huge efforts happening in multiple markets around the globe. So Joshua is going to share what they have learned with our partners, WWF and others, and then we will come back to all of you for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So Joshua, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Appreciate the introduction. I'm going to try to share my screen as we tested a few minutes ago. Let's see if that works. And hopefully it will all be perfect. Okay. There we go. Can you see the title slide?
Perfect.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'll get going. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you and members. Really appreciate that. I should also begin, as is customary in Australia, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where I am speaking. They are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors and other research partners and contributors to this work, especially Jack Thomas, Sharmi Ahmed, Vicky Antonopoulos, and Sinead Boylan, who are my co-authors on the work I'm going to describe to you, that you see the front cover there on the slide, and colleagues at UN Environment Programme, or UNEP, particularly Niels Hoyer, GlobeScan, who led a series of case studies, and others involved in the One Planet Network who sponsored this work. I'm going to talk mainly about this report, but the project as a whole has other components, which I'll briefly describe. So here's what I'm going to do in about 20-25 minutes. A little bit of introduction, a couple of comments on drivers of consumer food choices, and I'm aware there that I'm speaking to professionals in consumer goods, and apologies if I'm telling you how to suck eggs, I think is the colorful expression, but I think our interests are perfectly aligned, and hopefully we can get into some of the nuttier problems and next steps at the end of this presentation. I'm going to focus on sustainability information and consumer food choices, and then wrap up with a few conclusions and recommendations. As I said, all of this comes from the report that we prepared for the One Planet Network. The objectives of the project were simply, sound simple, wasn't in fact, to document best practices in communicating food sustainability credentials to consumers. There is a set of case studies of both food businesses and labeling organizations that were prepared by GlobeScan on the basis of interviews. It's possible that some people on the call today were interviewed by GlobeScan, I don't know. And the report that I'm going to mainly draw on today was a literature review, a desk study, looking at drivers of food choices, information sources that consumers rely on, how consumers respond to that information, particularly eco-labels, some of the challenges and opportunities to improve influence on consumer decision-making. And I should clarify that we're really focusing on the demand side on consumer choice. We don't assess the credibility or the truthfulness of the information that's presented on food products, whether through labels or other means. That would have been a whole different exercise. We're just focused on to what extent does information provided to consumers help them make better choices. To do that, we have to review a set of definitions or propose a set of definitions. These are drawn from the literature on what do we mean by sustainable food consumption. And we look at it both from a environmental perspective in, how much natural resource are you using, what environmental impact do you have, but also looking at meeting or exceeding global social standards and to do with worker health and safety, employment conditions, accessibility, and other social considerations. Having said that, the work was sponsored by WWF and UNEP, and therefore we really do emphasize the environmental side probably more than the social side. I guess a starting point for me in this work is just acknowledging that the food system is amazing. The fact that globally we have a system that can provide pretty reliable access to wonderful food for billions of people that is affordable for most, if not all. And that's worth celebrating. At the same time, we know there are many downsides or shortfalls in the food system that lead people to look for improvements. And I think this group is obviously part of that effort to look for and implement improvements. And those improvements have to deal with malnutrition, whether that's hunger or obesity, has to deal and tackle with the inequities in the food system, whether that's inequities to do with access to food or inequities in employment relationships, as well as the environmental side. So greenhouse gas emissions, land use change, freshwater use, decline of biodiversity in marine ecosystems due to pollution or overfishing or bycatch. You mentioned food waste, Sharon. That's obviously a major consideration. And we know that it's concentrated in high income households, and that implies a certain priority focus. We know that most of that food waste ends up in landfill, contributing even more to methane emissions, which are increasingly seen as a priority to address. And on the basis of all of these considerations, we're increasingly aware that we can't solve food system problems only on the supply side. We have to address the demand side as well, and that in particular, without dietary change, it may not be possible to stay within planetary boundaries and still ensure that everybody has an adequate and delicious diet. So sustainable consumption alongside sustainable production has to be part of delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals. On top of which we have the disruptions from COVID, which we're all getting to learning how to deal with, war in Ukraine and the disruptions to supplies of coarse grains and fertilizer, other supply side challenges such as availability and turnover of employees, low margins, volatile prices, access to land and water, deglobalization as it's called, and so on and so on. And looming over all of this is the threat of climate change, exacerbating the risks that we face. So we need a systemic response, and we draw on food systems analysis to frame this piece of work. But as I said earlier, we are really focusing here on consumer behavior and specifically on the role of information about food and the sustainability of food as a means of influencing consumer behavior. We acknowledge that many other interventions are required in different parts of the food system to achieve the outcomes we want. And there's lots of positive progress that we can point to, whether it's improved genetics, precision agriculture, onshore aquaculture, better logistics, voluntary certification and responsible sourcing, which is a topic I worked on for 10 years in a previous role in WWF, better packaging, reducing single-use plastics, blockchain for traceability, novel ingredients, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of really promising interventions on the supply side. My impression is that there's less progress, less innovation perhaps on the demand side. And there may be a good reason for that. My colleague at WWF, Jason Clay, some of you may know, has often said that it's easier to shift the practices of a few hundred or a few thousand large food businesses, or even the practices of millions of farmers, than it is to try to influence the food choices of 8 billion consumers. That's true, and yet the need to tackle food consumption is still there and has to be grappled with. So how do we grapple with consumption behaviors? Well, it starts with understanding drivers of food choice. And we know from the literature that it is incredibly complex. There are many different factors ranging from the physical characteristics of food itself to the information about that food, the social environment in which it is purchased, prepared, and consumed, the psychology of the individual, and a whole range of sort of external social factors. And trying to navigate that complexity is one of the major challenges we faced in this report, and that we face as practitioners trying to do the right thing. We know that when we look more carefully and focus on what people say they actually care about, it's not nearly so complex. This is from some surveys in the United States. And when we ask people what matters to them, they tend to emphasize just a few key attributes of food: taste, nutrition, affordability, availability. This is all familiar to you. Those are the top ranked criteria. And we see that environmental impact and social responsibility, while they feature, they're in the top handful of attributes that people say they care about. They are not top of the list by any means. And interestingly, on this chart, that ranking doesn't really change with educational status. So the bars represent no high school education on the top through graduate education attainment on the bottom. And the percentages are comparable. The rank is the same, and the relative importance is not all that different, which could be surprising, I suppose, to some people. We also know that that ranking hasn't really changed in consumers' minds over time, at least not in the United States, where environmental sustainability remains well below some of the other attributes that people care about. At the same time, we see the emergence of some new food preferences in many countries, including the rise of organic food. That goes back over 100 years now. And more recently, the growing interest in plant-rich diets and free-from foods. And just as an aside, plant-rich diets, of course, are traditional in many societies, but they are not necessarily high-status diets. And so we have this, I suppose, opposing forces, some driving people to eat more plant-based foods and less animal products, whereas in other markets, we see a strong drive to increase meat and dairy consumption. But in general, whether preferences are leading in this kind of direction or towards increased consumption of animal products, consumers need to rely on certain sources of information to make their choices. And we know, again, this is data from the United States, that consumers rely on many different sources of information about food to make their decisions, and that labels, focus of this particular project, are just one source of information. And we know, unfortunately, consumers don't always get the most reliable information, which can lead to some confusion. Public perceptions may be inaccurate. For example, whether it's better from a climate perspective, in this case, to eat locally produced food versus eating less meat. And in many countries, consumers, the public, believe that eating locally is the best thing you can do for the climate, when in fact, the science tells us that, that's not the case, and that eating a plant-based diet is going to make a much bigger difference. So this slide shows what consumers think is the case, and India, interestingly, is the only country that gets the answer right. But when we unpack the life cycle analyses and look at the data, we discover that while greenhouse gas emissions embodied in trade are substantial, moving to local food systems, local sourcing would really have very little impact. And the reason for that is because much of the savings from reducing international transport would simply be offset by increased domestic transport, which often relies on trucks and roads rather than more efficient means of transport internationally. But this is a live debate. In the science, you have just in this year, some saying we should pay much more attention to food miles and transport emissions, and others saying that's a red herring. What's going to make a bigger difference is what you eat, not where it's produced. Turning now to labels, we reviewed, we compiled the information we could get from, I think, around 18 to 20 systematic reviews or meta-analyses covering some 500 individual studies. We looked at about 30 individual case studies, many of those cross-country surveys with over 40,000 respondents. And we can draw from those meta-analyses, those systematic reviews, and from the case studies, some general observations about the role of eco-labels as a means of communicating information about sustainability to consumers in ways that influence their choices. And we can see from that literature that the eco-labels and associated guidelines do increase the accuracy of consumers' choices when they are selecting environmentally friendly foods. And we can see that well-designed labels are effective at conveying meaningful information, particularly when they are easy to understand. And interestingly, as an economist, I look for the evidence on willingness to pay, and consumers consistently say they are willing to pay more for labeled products. Having said that, they're not prepared to pay very much more than the going price. So here's an example, a meta-analysis of some 35 experiments involving over 35,000 participants all around the world, suggesting that consumers are willing to pay a small premium for eco-labeled or organic foods across all categories. So there is a positive influence of eco-labels and sustainability information, but it's modest. And we have to acknowledge and recognize that labels by themselves are probably not going to be the whole answer, particularly given some of the challenges that labels face. I mentioned lots of case studies. Must be said that most of those case studies are hypothetical. They're survey-based. And we found a few examples in the scientific literature of, I suppose, tests in the real world, in the wild, so to speak, where labels were introduced in some retail outlets, but not in others, and some products, not others. And we can test the consumer reaction there over several weeks or months. Again, there is a small positive response. And I think even allowing for selection bias in the scientific publishing process, the balance of evidence would suggest that yes, it does make a difference, but it's a small difference. So consumers will tell you one thing, they may not always do quite as much as they will say they do, but they tend to do a little bit. Having said that, we also know that labels are more effective with some consumers than others. You probably know this already. Female and younger shoppers, those with higher incomes or greater levels of education, and especially those with aligned values and beliefs are more inclined to pay attention to the labels and make decisions on that basis. We also see some widespread evidence that labels are misinterpreted. I talked earlier about misperceptions about locally sourced versus plant-based foods. And there are many other types of confusion or misinterpretations, maybe willful, maybe self-serving, maybe just careless, assuming that if the materials used in the packaging are sustainable, then the product on the inside should be also, or attributing health benefits to products that have an environmental label, even when that's not what the label assesses. But that's quite commonplace, unfortunately. Moving on, I think what we have started to learn just in the last few years is that when we apply lessons from psychology and behavioral science, we can get a bit more impact. And so if information is combined with a motivational goal, or if it emphasizes social norms, that can trigger changes in behavior more than just the information itself. Hardly surprising, you go back to that drivers of food choice table I showed earlier. People are attentive to social influences. And so if we can leverage those social influences and I suppose less rational motivations, then that can make a difference. Building a community, ask the expert videos, offering product samples. So there's a range of things that you'll be familiar with that accompany the information that I guess are part of marketing and promotion that can supplement the information we get on a label. Changing psychosocial constructs is a rather elaborate way of explaining what you can achieve by getting people to try something and confirming that it's okay, it's tasty, and that it meets their needs. And most of all, there was a huge study done, published a few months ago on the looking at behavioral interventions across a range of domains, and discovered that food choices are one of the most responsive areas for using choice architecture intervention. So putting the plant-based option in front of the animal food, meat or dairy products, for example. And there's been a lot written about behavioral approaches and choice architecture interventions in particular. We're starting to see that perhaps they can make a difference, a little bit like the labels themselves, but it's not huge. So here's an example recently published, carried out in Tesco Express convenience stores across England back in 2015. Apologies if you've seen this already. And they simply excluded certain unhealthy products from the checkout area in those stores, and then looked at whether the fact that the product wasn't there at the checkout made a difference in what people will spend and what the share of these unhealthy products in their baskets. And they did see a small decrease in the proportion of the total spend on less healthy foods, even though overall spend went up over the period, and even though other supermarkets in the UK did not see that slight decline. That decline looks tiny, it's statistically significant, but is it enough to shout about? Is it the silver bullet? No, but perhaps combined with the labeling and other interventions, we can start to make a difference. And I think one of the main conclusions we drew from our work is that because there's no silver bullet, we do need to combine different interventions. So the information can be combined with co-branding, with shopping apps, with emotional appeals and stories, with micro incentives, with efforts to create or strengthen social norms around sustainable food, with nudges. I've talked about the choice architecture, and maybe some other psychological tactics. And that was demonstrated by this example from Unilever and Knorr meal kits in the Netherlands, in which they tried to combine the behavioral approach of the profile of the plant-based menu offering, backed up by QR codes, social media, the website, and in-store promotions. And they did, it appears, see a positive response. Sharon asked me, has this continued? I don't know the answer to that, but if there's anyone from Unilever or Knorr on the call today, they can let us know. I think that is a key issue: is can you sustain these kind of strategies? Is it cost effective, and are the impacts lasting? Meanwhile, despite the innovations, we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, increases in meat consumption, especially in emerging economies, whether that's upper middle income, lower middle income, perhaps less so low income, but these are projections for the increase or growth in meat consumption in these different markets over the next 8 years now. And as you can see, the FAO and OECD are anticipating quite dramatic increases in meat consumption. And the ones that we care about probably the most in the environmental community are beef and sheep, or beef and lamb. So while demand for animal products is increasing in emerging economies and developing markets, in the global north, where we have seen some signs of changing dietary preferences, nevertheless, the prospects for plant-based meat and dairy substitutes are highly uncertain and perhaps not as promising as we had initially thought. And that's partly to do with cultural tastes and inertia and just what people like. I went out earlier today and had a hamburger for lunch. So there you go. It's not something I want to give up easily. And yet I recognize the environmental impacts associated with that. A few conclusions and recommendations. So consumer information is necessary but insufficient. Sustainability is only one of many drivers of consumer food choices. Preferences are shifting. They're often correlated and confused. Labels are proliferating alongside a whole range of new rating systems. Consumers do respond positively, but the response is fairly modest. How we communicate matters as much as what we say, and behavioral methods or incentives can help a bit. And apologies if that sounds a bit defeatist. As I said, there's no silver bullet here. It's a combination of many different strategies that can make when combined, can make a difference. So what else have we got? We've got government interventions, and they rely very heavily, as you know, on fairly crude measures, dietary guidelines, mandatory standards, nutritional labeling, sugar taxes, advertising restrictions, trade bans at the extreme end. And some of these are necessary, but they're probably not sufficient. And as I say, they're a bit crude. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we've got more sophisticated solutions on the supply side than we have seen to date on the demand side. Some recommendations, I think there's around 21 in the report, but just a few here around the importance of science-based communication that is intelligible, visible, credible, holistic, and comparable across products and diets. And some of that comes from UNEP's earlier work on guidelines for communicating sustainability to consumers. There's a 2017 report and set of principles that's worth a look, and we encourage people to sign up to. Eco labels, as I said earlier, need to be part of an integrated package, not standalone, ideally tailored to different audiences. Perhaps there's an opportunity to learn from that segment of the market, consumer market, who do rely on eco labels. What can we learn from their experience, their perspectives, to strengthen social norms around food sustainability. They are leaders, essentially, and yet we're not necessarily treating them as leaders. Governments can do a lot, as I mentioned, maybe sometimes more sophisticated things than they have done in the past around dietary guidelines and incentives. They can encourage businesses to make sustainable food the default option. I think that would be a promising approach. Ensure that it's not just sustainability is not just an elite choice, but something that is accessible to everyone. And lastly, in bold down there, businesses should invest, collaborate, and share their data to promote more sustainable consumer food choices. So one of the challenges we had in this project was getting information about companies' actual experience with communicating about food and about sustainability to their customers. My impression is that companies in the food sector, they know an awful lot more than they are sharing, and for obvious reasons. It's commercially sensitive, it's part of your competitive advantage, and yet it means that we don't have as much information as we might like to be able to jointly, collaboratively take steps forward to get better results with consumer behavior. Maybe part of the answer also is on the marketing and promotion side. People in your industries are masters of consumer marketing and advertising. And yet, as some leaders in the industry are recognizing, there's probably room for more responsible marketing behaviors and more efforts to encourage consumers to choose sustainably rather than just choose what is most profitable for the ad agency or for the client. I have not delved into sustainable marketing, but I'm delighted to see that it's on people's agenda, and would love to learn more from Consumer Goods Forum members on what you are doing in the responsible marketing space, and more generally, how we can work together to promote more sustainable consumption. And with that, thank you for listening, and look forward to the discussion. I will stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Joshua, for all of that information. And I'm sure that people listening live or on the recording, so much of it will resonate with all of the members that work with us in the coalition. And I have so much more information that I can share with you on what we've achieved. But many of the challenges that you presented really, really resonate with what we're trying to do, and getting that impact at scale is really the silver bullet that we're all trying to look for. So I'll start off with audience questions that have come in. Let's dig right into it. The first two are actually probably quite linked. So what's the most common misperception you see from consumers? You did speak about pearls of perception and how big its impact is, and maybe you can link it to the second question, which is around, it's interesting that misperception about healthier products that have some eco-label. Do people choose more based on the perceived health or the environmental factors?
All right. Well, I emphasize this confusion about whether locally produced foods were better for the climate versus plant-based foods, and that's certainly a widespread perception. I've encountered that in my own organization in WWF. There's a kind of almost a knee-jerk assumption that, oh well, if I buy local food, that must be good, right? And yet the life cycle analyses tell us that no, that's not the case environmentally. So localism it has other benefits, and I can understand why people like to buy locally because of the connection with their food shed, so to speak. But from a purely environmental perspective, it's not necessarily the best. There's very strong feelings about genetically modified organisms, as you know, in some markets, and it's a controversial issue. Is that a misperception? I don't know. I think people are still investigating that, but I know that there's very strong feelings there. Might be going a bit far to call that a misperception. But it kind of depends what you're concerned about. If you're concerned about climate change, and we all should be, then that will lead you to certain food choices or certain observations about food. And in particular, the beef and lamb just sort of stand out as problematic from a climate perspective, from a land use perspective. And yet people love their beef and dairy. And so it's almost like people don't want to know the reality of it because they like me, they like their hamburger, right? What was the second one? Misperceptions about healthier products that have some eco label. Well, we know, at least from surveys in the US and Europe, that people rank health and nutrition higher than they do environmental or social sustainability. And so I think maybe there's a bit of wishful thinking there that if they see the eco label, that is going to meet their desire for more nutritious or healthier foods, even though that's not what the label is about.
And you've almost led into the next question where you did mention it, obviously. Yes. Consumption of animal protein, and it's would you expect that a label indicating the environmental impact of beef, for example, would actually reduce its consumption, or taste and cultural aspects are just stronger?
I think it probably depends on the consumer segment and the market. So for some people, that aspirational aspect of eating red meat is going to remain important, or just the cultural and personal history, and it's delicious. There's no question. Would a label make a difference? I think it would with some consumer segments, but those may be people who are already value aligned and more inclined to move to vegetarian choices. So would it make a difference to the broad market? I'm not sure. In Australia, we're now starting to see claims of carbon neutrality on beef products. So that's a test. We'll see what the consumer response to that will be. It hasn't been around for very long, but several brands and retailers are pursuing that. Yeah, I think the science is pretty clear that if we're concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, and especially methane in emissions in the food system, then we do somehow have to tackle the red meat challenge. That's I don't like that conclusion, but that's the reality. Yeah.
Well, it actually links, Josh, to another question here. It's could a solution be if we strengthen the meat traceability in order to show consumers what they're eating? You know, would that have an impact?
It could do. So I'm going to share my screen again, if I may, and let's see. So yes. Here we go. This is what I wanted to show. There is variation in environmental impact, or in specifically greenhouse gas emissions, within any given production system. So if you look at beef and lamb, you can see there's a very wide variation in greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein in this case. And these are just different sources of protein. But no matter how good your beef or lamb, you're still a long way from plants. You know, we should all eat more nuts, clearly. Why? Because trees store carbon. So if you increase your nut plantation, you actually are drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. But yes, I think labels can help educate the consumers about the relative impact of the particular product that they are consuming. So rating schemes that give you the carbon footprint of a product are perhaps more informative. I think people there's quite a lot of education required. People, for example, and I showed you some of the misperceptions between local and plant-based. That comes from a report that looks at a whole range of misperceptions. If you want to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, don't have children, right? But nobody wants to hear that. Right? So there are some choices that just don't sell. But yes, I do think that more information enables people to make more informed choices, as long as that's combined with changes in the social norms and social feedback loops that lead people to want to make those changes and not just resist them or react against them.
Great, thank you. Cesar from Logicia in Colombia says, thank you, Josh, for your presentation. Could you go deeper into the greenhouse gas emissions, the small difference between global and local trade? There is a paradigm questioned. You may have answered that already, but.
Yes, so I'm relying on analysis done by Hannah Ritchie and colleagues at Our World in Data at Oxford University. I have a lot of time for Hannah and her work, and she was reacting to research published, I think, in Nature Food a few months ago, in which the researchers, including some here at University of Sydney, and I work quite closely with them also, they were trying to quantify food miles. What's the carbon footprint of food trade? They took a rather unusual approach to measuring what they included in food miles. And Hannah Ritchie and others have pointed out that perhaps they were over-egging the pudding, so to speak, by piling in emissions from all of the inputs and all of the equipment used to produce food, not just the operational emissions. I'm getting a little bit too technical here, but the bottom line is that if you switch from imports to locally produced food, because most people live in cities, you still got to move that food around. It ends up being moved around with trucks. Trucks are not as fuel efficient as trains and boats, and therefore you end up offsetting a lot of the emission savings from not importing. It just gets emitted on your roads in your country. So that's the bottom line. But if you want, I'm happy to follow up and provide the research papers that underpin that debate and that analysis.
Great, thank you. Going back to the topic of beef, Sarah would like to know, do you know in what products the majority of beef is used in? For example, roast beef joint, burgers, etc. How is this linked to ultra processed food, which in itself is a huge topic in this healthier and more sustainable diet space?
That's a great question. I don't actually know the breakdown. I know that when you butcher a steer or a former dairy cow, which is a major source of beef meat, it goes to lots of different places. Some of it goes into pet food. Some of it goes into mince. I think a former colleague of mine worked quite closely with McDonald's. He now works for Tyson Foods, a big meat packing business. And I think he said something like 20% of all the Australian beef produced ends up as trim, goes into ground beef. A lot of it ends up in burgers, but or in processed food. So yeah, I don't know the breakdown is the short answer, but it's, as I said at the beginning, the food system is absolutely amazing. The amount of value extracted from every part of every product is extraordinary.
Great, and actually, thank you. This is one that we actually were talking about, Joshua, before people joined. A question I missed was, could you see an eco label that would be an environmental label that would be global in nature and acknowledged across the world? Can you see that ever happening?
Well, so I'm an environmental economist, as I said at the outset. ideal world, we don't need the labels because all the damages has been internalized in prices, and the people who are producing the food, they already factor in the carbon, the emissions and the water and the land use, and so that's already built into the price of the product. That's the ideal, but we're a long way from that ideal. In the interim, labels are a kind of, they're a second best, they're a backstop, right? They're a way of compensating for the fact that prices are not accurate. So can I imagine a global label? Yes, I can. Do I think it's going to happen anytime soon? Not really. And I suppose that's partly because people have different preoccupations, different concerns. I could imagine a carbon label, and that might be a good thing, because I think that's now reached climate change, and carbon has reached a level of public awareness and political commitment and corporate commitment that you could do something that way on a global scale. And the metrics are relatively simple. But when you get into something like nature or biodiversity or even water, labels are they're less transferable because those impacts are very site specific, right? A ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon wherever it is. But impacts on, deforestation is terrible anywhere, but it's worse in some places than others. And so a label that is telling you consumers about deforestation would have to tell you where was that deforestation occurring. And I think that once you get into the complexity, you lose, eyes glaze over, and you lose the attention of the consumer, I suspect. But a carbon label, sure, why not? As a stepping stone towards total decarbonization, right? So if we achieve our net zero goals, and if we implement a price on carbon, which finally the business community has got behind also, then you don't need the label. It's already built in, right?
It's very, very interesting, and definitely a question that we've been asked at the Consumer Goods Forum, and kind of the role that we could play in that space. And we work obviously a lot in the health space, and you did mention kind of consumer confusion, and we see that confusion in the health space, and now we're adding on additional information in the environmental space. And yeah, it's kind of, yeah, we're running out of time, but any comments on that kind of confusion and what you're seeing kind of happening in this space? And health is so local, and choices
Yes.
are so local. And yeah, what are you seeing kind of around that proliferation of environmental labels that are popping up all around the world, and any kind of recommendations or advice you'd have for the members listening?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to see more consistency or mutual harmonization of different labeling schemes. So starting with national nutritional labeling, quite commonplace, and yet it's different in different jurisdictions. So it'd be good to start there. And then maybe we can also look at mutual recognition or harmonization of some of the eco labels. Some of them are already global. Fair trade is global. Marine stewardship is global. Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil is global. But could we put those together? I mean, I've always found it odd, for example, that we have one label for wild caught fish, all species, anywhere in the world. That's Marine Stewardship Council. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing by a long shot. And yet, when you come to agricultural commodities, there's just an endless proliferation. Oh, let's do soybeans. Let's do cotton. Let's do beef. Let's do lamb. Let's do sheep, right? And each time we build a separate infrastructure. Why not, as you say, have a single label for agricultural sustainability? I think that's doable. And organizations like the Consumer Goods Forum could play a leading role in helping to pull those strands together, so that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel and just taking up more packaging space with yet another icon.
We'll take back all these recommendations to the core team. And then I think the last question that we'll have time for, Josh, was you did mention this, do we really need labels? And then the question is on the internalization of the price would mean that certain products would not be accessible to a large segment of the market. Would beef be only for the rich?
Okay, that's a trick question. So, would beef be only for the rich? Let me give an example. Salmon. Farmed salmon is probably the third most consumed fish species in Australia, right? One out of every 3 kilos of fish consumed in Australia is farmed salmon. If we only had wild salmon, it would be just a pure luxury because there's very little of it, and we wouldn't be eating it. Basically, we do get some Alaskan salmon. It's delicious. It's not in prime condition by the time it gets to Australia. But Mark, I think, again, the economist in me says markets adapt. So if certain types of beef become very expensive, we will find other products that people will enjoy as much or more. And I don't know what those products are, but you can do a lot with pork. You can do a lot with poultry, right? So I'm not worried that people will not enjoy delicious food. I think if we are honest with ourselves and honest about the adverse environmental impacts of certain products, then they will either have to become more expensive or regulated out of existence. And then the question is, well, what other products can we put forward to meet people's needs and their preferences? And I have no doubt that the ingenuity of members of the Consumer Goods Forum will find those tasty, delicious alternatives to put in front of people, even if certain products have become prohibited. Let me go back, give you another example. I think I grew up in the United States, as you can probably tell from my accent. When the Europeans arrived in the US, they didn't care much for lobsters. They fed them to their pigs. Right? It was considered junk food. Salmon too, by the way. Wild salmon was not fit for human consumption. So preferences change, tastes change. Let's recognize that and not necessarily try to cling on to things that we now know are seriously problematic. Or if we are going to continue to consume them, let's treat them as they are, as luxury items. So the mantra in WWF when it comes to red meat is less and better. Let's eat less of it and let's eat higher quality and make sure that quality includes environmental sustainability.
Well, brilliant, Josh. We've come up to the end of our time. I hope everyone listening has enjoyed it as much as I have, and definitely really clear messaging for us to continue to work on that honesty, transparency, of course, delicious, accessible and affordable for all. So we'll keep you up to date on all the progress that we're making with our initiatives all around the world. A big thank you to everyone for listening, and a special thank you to you, Josh, for joining us on this series, and we'll see everyone on Learning Series number 7 on the 2nd of November. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Josh.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.